Sometimes the strength of a franchise is about who you can slap on the box. Players want to assume the role of an iconic character, and even when they have a large roster of supporting actors, the majority of video game franchises make it pretty evident who their top dogs are. The issue though is few franchises have a habit quite like Resident Evil of inventing new heroes and then leaving them discarded in the great big toy box of protagonists, sometimes for several decades. You can be sure that these are just a few of the Resident Evil characters that won't get a look in ever again. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and this is 8 memorable Resident Evil characters you'll never see again. Number 8. SHEVA ALOMAR. For a long time, Resident Evil 5 was the best-selling entry in Capcom's mammoth horror franchise, off the back of the huge success that was Resident Evil 4, landing on multiple platforms all at once, and containing full campaign co-op for the first time. It was an easy recipe for big bucks. Chris Redfield was joined by a brand new player character and fellow anti-bioterrorism agent SHEVA ALOMAR as they fought through hordes of brain-munching monsters in their never-ending pursuit of peace. SHEVA became a recognisable face in this era to every player too who blasted their way through Resident Evil 5's campaign, or every solo player who lambasted her terrible first aid spray wasting AI. More than that, she offered something fresh to the roster of Resi heroes in a series that is typically set in rural America. Unfortunately, Capcom didn't see the value in her, and the SHEVA erasure began immediately when the Gold Edition reissue of Resident Evil 5 dropped. Instead of Chris and SHEVA, the front cover featured the pairing of Chris and Jill Valentine, despite the fact that Jill is only playable in the additional DLC and not the full main course campaign. Since then, SHEVA has scarcely been seen or heard from again. Number 7. Billy Cohen. As with every Resident Evil character that makes it through their ordeal, fans will speculate about the possibility of them returning. Resident Evil Zero's Billy Cohen is no exception. He's one of many characters who have appeared just once and left fans wanting more. After refusing to commit war crimes and being falsely charged with mass murder, Billy is sentenced to death. However, on his way to prison, his transport is overturned in the woods around the Spencer mansion. He bumps into Rebecca Chambers, and the two have to team up to survive a hellacious night of zombies, giant insects, and frustrating inventory systems. What I'm saying is, Billy Cohen has been through plenty already, so if you're asking to see him in another game, then maybe you're just cruel. However, in an interview with the staff behind the Netflix CGI series Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, it was teased that at one stage they thought of bringing Billy out of retirement for the first time in 18 years. They then ultimately decided against that and instead went back to Old Faithful himself, Leon S. Kennedy. So whilst Capcom haven't forgotten about Billy, he's clearly not the priority. Number 6. Zoe Baker. Resident Evil 7's hook was its shift away from worldwide bioterror to something more remote, more personal, and downright creepier. The majority of the title saw the player as regular schmuck Ethan Winters, wandering about the Baker family estate and hiding from its infected residents where possible. Jack, Marguerite, and son Lucas were all as twisted and as scary as each other in their own ways. The Baker daughter Zoe was the exception to the rule, and, being free from whatever plagued the rest of her family, she guided the player around the property to seek the antidote and escape. In the canon version of events, Ethan only has enough antivirus to save his wife Mia, and regretfully leaves Zoe behind. A controversial decision considering mere hours ago his wife was running towards him with a chainsaw and Zoe has been nothing but an angel. Nice one, Ethan. Luckily, the story of Zoe's own escape continues in a DLC chapter and in a special in-game dossier included with certain releases of Resident Evil Village. It's confirmed that Zoe has started a new life under witness protection. It was a really nice touch for Capcom to address this character's fate in both End of Zoe and RE Village's lore, and we can be rest assured now that she's safe, Zoe will be staying away from strange houses built on the bayou that may or may not contain cannibal families. Number 5. Ark Thompson. Even as someone who has a soft spot for this runt of the early Resi litter, it's not hard to see why Capcom hasn't acknowledged the existence of Resident Evil Survivor in about 20 years. The series' first foray into the first-person perspective is short, sluggish, and not all that much to look at either. If anything, it's most memorable for its voice acting, which arguably outpaces the original game when it comes to balls-out absurd line delivery. There isn't a single normal-sounding character across the entire spectrum of Resident Evil Survivor, and that extends to the game's protagonist, Ark Thompson. Our would-be hero spends most of the game suffering from amnesia, but it's hard to root for his pursuit of the truth when it sounds less like amnesia and more likely he's suffering from severe narcolepsy. Ark drops one single line that connects him to the rest of the Resident Evil universe, claiming to be an associate of Leon S. Kennedy's, but considering that Leon has never mentioned the guy, we wonder if the poor bloke just thinks they're friends because Leon said hi to him once in the corridor. Number 4. Ashley Graham. Resident Evil 4 has a claim to not just be one of the most beloved games in the Biohazard series, but also of its mid-2000s era. Despite being a little clunky in retrospect, any gamer who played it at the time will do two things. Firstly, regale you with stories of crowds of Ganado villagers bearing down on them, clearing through them with their attaché case of weapons, and feeling like an action movie badass in the process. And second, complain about the escort missions. They were fewer and further between than most people realise, but if anything, that says more about how rage-quit-inducingly frustrating it was when Ashley demanded Leon's help in as shrill a voice as possible. Having to multitask puzzles and rescue the president's daughter from being carried off into the mysterious dark door at the same time was like real-life babysitting. Except in this instance, we'd rather let the chanting cultists take Ashley away altogether. Many Resident Evil characters can't return to the series because they're dead. In this case, Ashley won't return to the series because most players wish she was. Number 3. Jake Muller. Resident Evil 6 was stuffed to the gills with as much content as possible and designed to appeal to all different kinds of audiences, and as such, the finished product was an exhausting, bloated mess of 4 interweaving campaigns and more QuickTime events than your poor tired thumbs can handle. At the very least, it tried to introduce us to a whole new roster of characters who were primed to take centre stage. After all, who wants to be playing as an arthritic 60-year-old Chris Redfield? Because that day is fast approaching. The boldest among Resi 6's new stars was Jake Muller. The unwanted son of Albert Wesker, Jake spent his time in Resident Evil 6 grappling with the reality of his situation, his legacy, and the negative impact of his rather eccentric father who once tried to, take over the world. Jake's tale of morality was out of place in the explosive Michael Bay-esque bombast of Resident Evil 6, which strangely made it the most interesting story strand of the lot. For better or for worse, the critical reaction to Resident Evil 6 put the brakes on the planned trajectory of the franchise and made Capcom stop and take stock of the situation. Considering every time anyone mentions this title, it's to quite rightfully make a joke about its absolute failure, it seems that Capcom are hesitant to reuse any of the characters that the game introduced. Thus, Jake and company, who seemed at one stage poised to take the torch from our heroes, are lost in limbo. Number 2. Bruce McGivern. Through its 26-year history, Resident Evil has had to evolve to survive, and this has taken many forms, from perspective shifts like Resident Evil 4 to online multiplayer games like Resident Evil Resistance. We've previously mentioned Survivor, which kicked off a strange little series of titles, all with a light gun focus. The final release in the West, titled Resident Evil Dead Aim, may just be the weirdest one of them all, as it combines third-person exploration that switches to first-person action when the player aims their weapon. Resident Evil Dead Aim's cast is limited to the 3 most obvious roles of every story: protagonist, love interest, and villain. The characters themselves, however, are anything but obvious. In particular, our leading man, Bruce McGivern, is like a cross between the world's most inept agent and a misshapen Stretch Armstrong. Clearly based upon Brad Pitt's character in the cult classic thriller Seven, Bruce takes after his predecessor Ark with dialogue that sounds drunk, fumbled through the most impromptu southern drawl ever concocted. Whilst the cutscenes are decent for the time, there's something truly horrifying and alien about Bruce McGivern's disproportionate design that makes him a damn sight scarier than any monster that you face in the game. Dead Aim's story or characters don't interact with the broader canon, which has allowed Capcom to ignore this experiment and leave it, and thus Bruce, trapped on the PlayStation 2 where he probably belongs. Number 1. Carlos Oliveira. When the remake of Resident Evil 3 rolled around, it did wonderful things for Jill Valentine and her supporting cast. A brilliant throwback to these beloved characters reimagined in a modern light. None more so than Carlos Oliveira, who transformed from a bit of a hokey Latino stereotype in the 1999 original game to a hunky stud who respected personal boundaries in the remake. Carlos's sum total Resident Evil appearances amount to treading water. Essentially, anytime the series goes back to the well of Raccoon City and revisits that era, we might get a Carlos appearance. But beyond that, he's never had an original story that pushed his character forward, purely because he was never that popular of a character until his remake redesign. Now, with 20 years of Resident Evil history between his original appearance and today, it might be difficult to find a place for him in Biohazard's long-running timeline. poor Carlos. He peaked too late. It's not so much a case of you don't know what you have until it's gone, so much as you don't know what you could have had until we figured out what he should be, but by now it's a bit irrelevant. Oops.